The stagecoach jolted to a halt, sending Charlotte Everett lurching forward against her carpetbag as dust swirled outside the window. After 6 days of bone-jarring travel across the frontier, she had finally arrived in Copper Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1878, a place she'd never seen but had agreed to call home. "Last stop, Copper Creek," the driver called, his voice carrying on the dry summer air. Charlotte gathered her belongings with trembling hands. Beneath her traveling suit, a letter pressed against her heart correspondence from Mr. Frederick Thornton, who had placed an advertisement seeking a bride in a Boston newspaper 4 months prior. Their exchange of letters had been brief but promising. He had written of a comfortable home, a prosperous cattle business, and the need for a sensible wife to share his life. "Need a hand, miss?" The driver stood at the door, offering assistance as Charlotte descended from the coach. "Thank you, sir." She stepped down onto Wyoming soil for the first time, her boots immediately coated with a fine layer of dust. The small frontier town spread before her, a single dirt thoroughfare lined with wooden buildings, some boasting false fronts that reached optimistically toward the endless blue sky. Charlotte smoothed her travel-wrinkled skirts and adjusted her bonnet. She had taken great care with her appearance this morning, despite the limitations of travel. Her chestnut hair was neatly pinned, her face freshly washed with precious water from her canteen. First impressions mattered, especially when meeting one's future husband, but something was wrong. The town had an unsettled quality, not the usual bustle of a Wednesday afternoon. Several businesses were shuttered, with black crepe hanging from doorways. A group of men in somber attire stood outside what appeared to be a church at the far end of the street. "Excuse me," she called to the stagecoach driver who was unloading luggage. "I'm to meet Mr. Frederick Thornton. Would you happen to know where I might find him?" The driver paused, a trunk balanced against his knee, his weathered face creased with what could only be described as pity. "Madam, I think you might want to head on over to the church yonder," he said quietly, "that there's a funeral procession, and if I'm not mistaken." He cleared his throat. "It's for Frederick Thornton himself." Charlotte felt the blood drain from her face. There must be some mistake. "I received a letter from him just 3 weeks ago." "No mistake, madam. Took a bad fall from his horse last week while checking fence lines. Neck broke clean through." The driver looked genuinely sorrowful. "The whole town's turned out. He was well respected hereabouts." Charlotte stood motionless, her carpetbag suddenly leaden in her grip. 6 days by train from Boston to Cheyenne, 2 more by stagecoach to this remote outpost, all her worldly possessions packed in 3 trunks, her family home sold, and now this. "I don't understand," she whispered, though there was nothing to understand. Death needed no explanation, especially in these untamed territories. The driver patted her shoulder awkwardly. "Town's got a decent boarding house if you're wanting to rest before deciding what comes next." "Thank you," Charlotte said automatically, though her mind whirled with the enormity of her situation. Without Frederick Thornton, she had no home, no future, and precious little money after the expense of her journey. Almost without conscious thought, Charlotte found herself walking toward the church. She needed to see for herself to make this nightmare real. As she approached, she noticed a pine coffin resting on trestles outside the church door. The mourners, perhaps 20 in all, stood in a loose semicircle as a preacher read from his Bible. She kept her distance, not wanting to intrude upon their grief. These people had known Frederick Thornton. They had shared meals with him, conducted business with him, perhaps even loved him. She had only his letters' formal, precise descriptions of the land and climate, along with his expectations of a wife. The service concluded, and 4 men lifted the coffin onto a wagon. The mourners began to drift away in pairs and small groups, some casting curious glances her way. Charlotte remained still, uncertain what to do next. "Miss," a deep voice startled her from her thoughts. "Pardon me, but would you be Charlotte Everett?" She turned to find a tall man regarding her with intense blue eyes. His dark hair was neatly combed for the funeral, but a cowboy's weathered complexion and calloused hands betrayed his occupation. He removed his hat, revealing a streak of premature silver at his temple. I am, she confirmed, wondering how he knew her name. Wyatt Morgan, he introduced himself with a slight bow. I worked with Frederick. He showed me your letters, said you'd be arriving today. Charlotte nodded, unable to find words. I'm sorry you've come all this way to such circumstances, Wyatt continued. His voice was gentle but direct. Frederick was a good man. I never had the chance to know him, Charlotte admitted, surprised by the hollow ache the words produced. Wyatt shifted his weight, hat still clutched respectfully in his hands. Miss Everett, I know this is sudden and entirely unconventional, but I feel I should speak plainly. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. Frederick and I were partners in the ranch. With his passing, I'll be taking over operations entirely, and the truth is, I need a wife just as badly as he did. Charlotte stared at him, certain she had misheard. I beg your pardon. What I mean to say is, Wyatt cleared his throat. You came out here expecting to marry and start a new life. I'm offering you that same opportunity. I know it's not what you planned, but perhaps in time we might suit each other well enough. She took a step back, shock giving way to indignation. Mr. Morgan, I have just learned of Mr. Thornton's death. I am standing within view of his coffin, and you propose marriage. I apologize for my timing, Wyatt said, his face coloring. But you should know your situation. This is a rough country for a woman alone. The nearest eastbound stage doesn't come through for another week. The boarding house charges $1 a night. Frederick mentioned you sold your home back east to make this journey. The blunt assessment of her circumstances stung, but Charlotte couldn't deny its accuracy. She had exactly $22 to her name after the journey, and no home to return to even if she could afford the fare. I appreciate your concern for my welfare, she said stiffly, but I cannot possibly consider such an arrangement at this moment. Wyatt nodded, replacing his hat. Of course, it was thoughtless of me to suggest it now. He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small card. My ranch is 3 miles north of town. If you find yourself in need of anything at all, please don't hesitate to call on me. Charlotte accepted the card automatically. His ranch, he'd said. Not their ranch, not Frederick's ranch. Already, the dead man's possessions had passed to new hands. Thank you, Mr. Morgan. Now, if you'll excuse me, I should arrange lodging. Wyatt gestured toward a 2-story building with a wide porch. Mrs. Holloway runs the boarding house. Tell her I sent you. She'll treat you fair. Charlotte nodded and turned away, desperate to escape his penetrating gaze. As she walked toward the boarding house, she could feel his eyes following her, and something else, a sense that her carefully planned future had not merely derailed, but had transformed into something unrecognizable. The boarding house was clean but sparse, with narrow beds and simple furnishings. Mrs. Holloway, a bustling widow with iron-gray hair and shrewd eyes, showed Charlotte to a small room on the second floor. It's 75 cents a night if you take your meals elsewhere, $1 if you eat with us, she explained, opening a window to let in fresh air. Wash basins there, privies out back, no gentlemen callers in the rooms. Thank you, I expect to stay a week, perhaps longer. Charlotte set her carpetbag on the bed, avoiding thoughts of what would happen when her funds ran low. Mrs. Holloway gave her an appraising look. You're the one who came to marry Frederick Thornton. News traveled quickly in small towns. Yes, Charlotte admitted, shame about that. He was a decent sort. Mrs. Holloway straightened a faded sampler on the wall. I heard Wyatt Morgan already offered to step in. Charlotte felt heat rise to her cheeks. Word travels quickly. Town this size, breathing is news, Mrs. Holloway chuckled. Don't look so scandalized. Won't be the first time a bride ended up with a different groom than she bargained for out here. I have no intention of marrying a stranger, Charlotte said firmly. Mrs. Holloway shrugged. Wasn't Frederick a stranger too? Before Charlotte could respond, she added, supper's at 6 sharp. Don't be late or you'll find slim pickings. Left alone, Charlotte sank onto the bed, finally allowing the tears she'd been holding back. She wept for the future she'd imagined, for her own foolishness in believing that happiness could be arranged by mail, and for the desperate situation in which she now found herself. When her tears were spent, she washed her face and changed into her second-best dress. Whatever happened next, she would face it with dignity, She had come west seeking a new beginning. It seemed she would get one, though not at all the kind she had expected. The next morning, Charlotte visited the town's small telegraph office and sent messages to the few acquaintances she had left in Boston, inquiring discreetly about potential employment. Then she walked to the general store, where she purchased a newspaper and studied the advertisements. Help wanted at the Copper Creek Hotel, experienced cook required, read one notice. Another sought a seamstress for the dressmaker's shop. Charlotte had some skill with a needle but doubted it would be sufficient for professional work. As for cooking, she knew the basics but had never prepared meals for a hotel full of guests. Morning, Miss Everett. Wyatt Morgan's voice startled her. He stood in the doorway of the store, sunlight silhouetting his tall frame. Mr. Morgan. She nodded politely, folding the newspaper. Looking for work? He asked, nodding toward the paper. I'm considering my options. Charlotte didn't appreciate his directness but found herself responding in kind. Wyatt stepped fully into the store, removing his hat. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday. I spoke hastily and without proper consideration for your feelings. Please accept my apology. The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. Apology accepted, Mr. Morgan. That said, he continued, my offer stands, not as a hasty arrangement but as something to consider. He gestured to the shopkeeper. Tom, I'll take 10 pounds of coffee and a box of those peppermint sticks. While the shopkeeper measured coffee beans, Wyatt turned back to Charlotte. I'd like to invite you to visit the ranch, see what sort of life would await you. No obligations, just information to help you decide. Charlotte hesitated. Propriety demanded she refuse. A respectable woman didn't visit a bachelor's home without chaperone, and yet this was the frontier. Different rules applied here. I appreciate the invitation, Mr. Morgan, but I'm not certain it would be appropriate. Mrs. Holloway could accompany you, he suggested. Or Reverend Peterson's wife. I'm not asking you to compromise your reputation, Miss Everett. His consideration for her reputation impressed her. Many men on the frontier wouldn't have bothered with such niceties. I'll consider it, she said finally. Wyatt's face brightened. That's all I ask. He paid for his purchases and tipped his hat to her. Good day, Miss Everett. As he left, Charlotte found herself studying him more carefully. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to physical labor, but there was a grace to him as well. Intelligence shone in those blue eyes, and he had been considerate of her feelings and her reputation, even while making a most unconventional proposal. Perhaps she would visit the ranch. Not because she was considering his offer, certainly not, but because she needed to understand all her options before making decisions about her future. That evening at the boarding house dinner table, Charlotte found herself seated beside Dr. Abernathy, the town's physician, and his wife. Across from her was Miss Penelope Whittaker, the school teacher. I understand you came to marry Frederick Thornton, Mrs. Abernathy said as she passed a bowl of mashed potatoes. Such a tragedy. Indeed, Charlotte murmured, tired of the pitying glances she'd received all day. What will you do now? Miss Whittaker asked, her expression genuinely concerned rather than merely curious. I'm exploring possibilities, Charlotte replied. I have some savings and I'm skilled at bookkeeping and correspondence. Dr. Abernathy nodded approvingly. Practical skills. Though opportunities for a lady's employment are limited here. I heard Wyatt Morgan offered to honor Frederick's commitment, Mrs. Abernathy said, not bothering to lower her voice. Charlotte nearly choked on her water. News does travel quickly here. Wyatt's a good man, Doctor. Abernathy commented. Known him for 5 years now, honest to a fault and hard-working. Is that so? Charlotte kept her tone neutral. Built that ranch from almost nothing, the doctor continued. He and Frederick worked well together, different temperaments but complementary skills. Charlotte found herself curious despite her determination to remain detached. In what way? Frederick had the head for business. Wyatt knows cattle and horses better than anyone in the territory. Together, they built one of the most successful operations in the county. Miss Whittaker leaned forward. And he reads, which is more than I can say for half the men around here, borrows books from me regularly, has quite thoughtful opinions about them too. I see. Charlotte absorbed this information, trying to reconcile it with the forthright cowboy she'd met. "Has he been in Copper Creek long?" came through about 6 years back, Mrs. Holloway interjected, refilling coffee cups. "Was just passing through, but Frederick convinced him to stay and help with the ranch. They became partners 3 years later, and he never married." Charlotte asked before she could stop herself. The table fell silent, glances exchanged across the potatoes and beef stew. "There was someone," Miss Whittaker said carefully, "a young lady from one of the neighboring ranches. It ended poorly." "Penelope," Mrs. Abernathy chided. "It's not our place to gossip." Charlotte wanted to press for details but knew it would be inappropriate. Instead, she steered the conversation toward more general topics: the weather, the upcoming harvest festival, the new shipment of goods expected at the general store. After dinner, as she prepared for bed, Charlotte found herself thinking about Wyatt Morgan, a cowboy who read books, a successful rancher, a man who had loved and lost. There was more to him than she had initially assumed. The following day, Charlotte visited the town's small bank to inquire about transferring her modest savings from Boston. As she left the building, she nearly collided with a young woman rushing past. "Oh, I beg your pardon," Charlotte exclaimed, steadying herself. "No harm done," the woman replied. She was perhaps 19 or 20, with blonde hair escaping from beneath a practical bonnet and a smattering of freckles across her nose. "You must be Miss Everett. I'm Winnie Davis. My pa runs the livery stable." "Pleased to meet you," Charlotte said, struck by the young woman's forthright manner. "I heard you might be marrying Wyatt Morgan now that Frederick's gone," Winnie said, her eyes bright with curiosity. Charlotte suppressed a sigh. "News certainly travels fast in Copper Creek." "Oh, it's not just here. I reckon they're talking about it all the way to Cheyenne by now." Winnie grinned, then sobered. "It would be a good match, you know. Wyatt's the finest man in the territory. You seem very certain of that." "He saved my brother's life last winter," Winnie said simply. "Blizzard came up sudden-like. Cody was caught out checking traps. Wyatt found him half frozen and carried him 3 miles through snow up to his knees." "That was very brave of him," Charlotte acknowledged. "That's just who he is," Winnie shrugged. "Anyway, I should get on. Pa needs these supplies." She hefted a paper-wrapped package. "But if you ever want someone to show you around, I'd be happy to." "Thank you, Winnie. I appreciate the offer." As the young woman hurried away, Charlotte found herself smiling. Perhaps she could make a life here, even if not the one she had planned. The people seemed friendly enough, if overly interested in her personal affairs. That evening, a knock came at her boarding house door. Mrs. Holloway called up the stairs. "Miss Everett, visitor for you in the parlor." Charlotte descended to find Wyatt Morgan standing awkwardly in the small parlor, hat in hand. He had clearly made an effort with his appearance. His hair was neatly combed, his shirt clean and pressed. "Mr. Morgan, this is unexpected." "Miss Everett," he nodded. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all." She gestured to a chair, taking the one opposite. Mrs. Holloway hovered nearby, ostensibly dusting but clearly intent on chaperoning. "I wanted to let you know that Frederick's will is being read tomorrow," Wyatt said. "As his intended bride, you might have some claim to his estate." "I thought you should be present." Charlotte blinked in surprise. "I wouldn't expect any such consideration. We weren't married." Nevertheless, Frederick was a careful man who planned for contingencies. "The reading is at 10 o'clock at Judge Wilson's office." "Thank you for informing me," Charlotte said, genuinely touched by his thoughtfulness. Wyatt shifted in his chair. "Have you given any thought to visiting the ranch?" "I have," Charlotte admitted. "If Mrs. Holloway would be willing to accompany me, perhaps we could arrange it for the day after tomorrow." From her position by the bookshelf, Mrs. Holloway nodded. "I could manage that." "Excellent." Wyatt's face brightened. "I'll send the wagon at 9 if that suits you ladies." With the arrangements made, Wyatt rose to leave. At the door, he paused. "Miss Everett, regardless of what happens with Frederick's will or other matters, please know that I consider it my duty to ensure you're not left stranded here without resources. If you choose to return east, I'll see that you have the means to do so." The offer stunned Charlotte. "That's extraordinarily generous, Mr. Morgan. It's what Frederick would have wanted," he said simply. "Good night, Miss Everett." After he left, Mrs. Holloway chuckled. Well, well. If that man isn't sweet on you already, I'll eat my best Sunday hat. Don't be ridiculous, Charlotte protested. He's simply being honorable, hum. Mrs. Holloway didn't look convinced, and I'm Queen Victoria. The next morning, Charlotte dressed with care in her most businesslike outfit, a navy blue skirt and jacket with a crisp white shirtwaist. At precisely 10 o'clock, she entered Judge Wilson's office, where several people had already gathered. Wyatt was there, along with Reverend Peterson, Dr. Abernathy, and a thin, sour-faced man Charlotte hadn't met, Miss Everett. Judge Wilson greeted her, rising from behind his desk. "Please have a seat. We were just about to begin." Charlotte sat in the vacant chair beside Wyatt, who acknowledged her with a nod. "For those who don't know, this is Miss Charlotte Everett, who came to Copper Creek to marry Frederick," the judge explained to the others. "Miss Everett, this is Mr. Silas Thornton, Frederick's cousin from Denver." The sour-faced man barely inclined his head. "A pleasure," he said, though his tone suggested anything, but Judge Wilson cleared his throat and unfolded a document. "I'll proceed with the reading of Frederick Thornton's last will and testament." The legal language washed over Charlotte. Most of it dealt with business matters, disposition of cattle, equipment, and cash reserves. The ranch property itself, she learned, was jointly owned by Frederick and Wyatt, with each partner's share passing to the other upon death. "To my cousin, Silas Thornton, I leave my collection of books and the sum of $100. Silas sniffed at this bequest, clearly having expected more. "And finally," the judge continued, "to Miss Charlotte Everett, who consented to be my wife sight unseen, demonstrating remarkable courage and faith. I leave the sum of $500 and my mother's wedding ring in recognition of the commitment she made, even though fate has prevented our union." Charlotte gasped. $500 was a small fortune enough to establish herself comfortably back east or to live on for quite some time even here. "I protest," Silas Thornton said immediately. "This woman was not his wife. She has no legal claim. The will is quite clear, Mr. Thornton," Judge Wilson said firmly. "Your cousin specifically provided for Miss Everett." "It's outrageous," Silas insisted. "She never even met Frederick. She's entitled to nothing." "The law and Frederick's wishes say otherwise," Wyatt interjected, his voice hard. Miss Everett traveled nearly 2,000 miles on Frederick's invitation. He clearly felt a moral obligation to her. Silas subsided, though his expression remained mutinous. After completing some paperwork, Judge Wilson handed Charlotte an envelope containing a bank draft and a small velvet box. "Frederick's accounts are in order," he explained. "The draft can be cashed at the bank whenever you wish." "Thank you," Charlotte said, still stunned by the unexpected bequest. She opened the velvet box to find a delicate gold ring set with a small pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "It was his mother's," Wyatt said quietly. "He kept it in his desk, said his bride would wear it someday." Charlotte closed the box, overcome with emotion for a man she had never met but who had shown such consideration for her welfare even in death. Outside the judge's office, Silas Thornton cornered her. "You may have fooled my cousin and these yokels, but I know an opportunist when I see one." "I beg your pardon." Charlotte drew herself up to her full height. "Women like you are all the same looking for a meal ticket." "Well, you've found one, haven't you? $500 for nothing more than exchanging a few letters." Before Charlotte could respond, Wyatt appeared at her side. "That's quite enough, Thornton. Miss Everett deserves your respect, not your accusations. This doesn't concern you, Morgan." "Anything concerning Miss Everett's welfare concerns me," Wyatt said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Now, I suggest you collect your books and your $100 and catch the next stage back to Denver." Silas glared at them both before storming away. Charlotte released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you, Mr. Morgan." "Wyatt, please." He offered his arm. "May I walk you back to the boarding house?" As they strolled along the dusty street, Charlotte found herself studying the man beside her with new interest. "You and Frederick were close, like brothers," Wyatt confirmed. "We disagreed plenty, but there was always respect. He was the smartest man I ever knew, could calculate figures in his head faster than most men can write them down. What made him place an advertisement for a bride?" Charlotte asked, genuinely curious. Wyatt considered this. Frederick was practical. He decided it was time to marry, and there aren't many eligible women out here. He wanted someone educated, someone who could help with the books and correspondence, someone who would bring refinement to his home. He glanced at her. After reading your letters, he said he'd found exactly what he was looking for. Charlotte felt a pang of regret for the life she might have had, and now I find myself at a crossroads. With Frederick's generous bequest, I could return east. Is that what you want? Wyatt asked, his expression carefully neutral. I don't know, Charlotte admitted. I came seeking a new life. The circumstances have changed, but perhaps the opportunity remains. They reached the boarding house and Wyatt released her arm. Tomorrow's visit might help clarify things. 9 o'clock, we'll be ready, Charlotte promised. That night, Charlotte lay awake, turning possibilities over in her mind. With $500, she had options she hadn't possessed 2 days ago. She could return to Boston and perhaps open a small shop or establish herself as a private secretary or bookkeeper. She could travel elsewhere, St. Louis, perhaps, or Chicago, and seek opportunities in a growing city, or she could stay in Copper Creek. The town needed a proper school, according to Miss Whittaker, who was overwhelmed teaching children of all ages. With her education, Charlotte could assist, or perhaps she could offer bookkeeping services to local businesses. And then there was Wyatt Morgan's unexpected proposal. Marriage to a stranger had been her original plan. Was it so different to consider a different stranger than the one she had expected? She removed Frederick's mother's ring from its box and slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if meant for her hand. A sign, or merely coincidence? Charlotte replaced the ring in its box. One thing was certain: she wouldn't make any decisions until after visiting the ranch tomorrow. Morning dawned clear and crisp, with the promise of heat later in the day. Charlotte chose a practical but becoming dress of pale blue cotton with a matching bonnet to shield her face from the sun. Mrs. Holloway, dressed in her second-best outfit, waited in the parlor. The wagon's here, she announced as hoofbeats sounded outside. Charlotte expected to see Wyatt, but instead, a young man of perhaps 16 sat holding the reins of a well-maintained buckboard. "Morning, ladies," he called cheerfully. "Mr. Morgan sent me to fetch you. I'm Caleb, the ranch hand." "Good morning, Caleb," Charlotte replied, allowing him to help her onto the seat. Mrs. Holloway settled beside her and they set off at a brisk pace. The land opened up beyond the town limits, rolling hills dotted with sagebrush, distant mountains blue on the horizon. The air smelled of dust and wild grasses, nothing like the coal smoke in close quarters of Boston. "It's pretty country," Charlotte remarked. "Yes," Caleb agreed. "Best cattle land in the territory, Mr. Morgan says." They crested a hill, and Charlotte caught her first glimpse of the Thornton Morgan ranch. A substantial log house stood in a clearing, with several outbuildings arranged nearby. A corral held a half-dozen horses, and in the distance, cattle grazed on the open range. "There it is," Caleb announced proudly. "Twin Creek Ranch, named for the two streams that join on the property." As they approached, Wyatt emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth. He wore the practical clothing of a working rancher: denims, a chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and worn boots. Yet there was something undeniably attractive about him in his element, confident and capable. "Welcome, ladies," he called, striding toward the wagon. "I hope the journey wasn't too uncomfortable." "Not at all," Charlotte replied as he helped her down from the seat. His hands were strong and calloused, but his touch was gentle. "I've asked Mrs. Fletcher, our cook, to prepare refreshments," Wyatt said, assisting Mrs. Holloway next. "I thought you might like to see the house first, then the rest of the property if you're interested." "That sounds perfect," Charlotte agreed. The main house was larger than it had appeared from a distance, 6 rooms downstairs and 3 above, solidly built from local timber. The furnishings were simple but of good quality, with a few unexpected touches of refinement. A Boston-made piano in the parlor, bookshelves lined with well-read volumes, and surprisingly fine curtains at the windows. "Frederick ordered those from a catalog," Wyatt explained, noticing her interest in the curtains. "Said a proper home needed proper window dressings. "In the kitchen, Mrs." Fletcher, a round, cheerful woman in her 50s, had laid out a spread of freshly baked bread, preserves, cold sliced ham, and apple tarts. "It's about time this house had a lady's touch," she declared, pouring coffee for everyone. "Been telling Mr. Morgan that for years, Mrs." "Fletcher lives in town with her husband but comes out 3 days a week to cook and clean," Wyatt explained. "The rest of the time we fend for ourselves. And a sorry job they make of it," Mrs. Fletcher added with a fond smile. "Found a boot in the soup pot last month." After refreshments, Wyatt showed them the rest of the house, including the master bedroom, a large, airy space with a handsome oak bed and chest of drawers. "Frederick had this furniture shipped from Denver last year," he said, "was part of his preparation for married life." Charlotte tried to imagine herself in this room, arranging her belongings, making it her own. It wasn't difficult. The house had a welcoming quality despite its bachelor occupants. Following the house tour, Wyatt led them outside to see the outbuildings, corrals, and garden. Everything was neat and well maintained, speaking to the care and pride the partners had taken in their property. "It's very impressive," Charlotte said sincerely. "You and Frederick built all this yourselves, with help," Wyatt acknowledged. "We employ 3 full-time hands now, plus extra workers during roundup and branding." "And what exactly would my role be, should I consider your proposal?" Charlotte asked directly. Mrs. Holloway busied herself examining a flowering shrub, giving them a semblance of privacy. Wyatt met her gaze directly. "You'd be mistress of the house first and foremost. Beyond that, it would depend on your interests and abilities. Frederick mentioned you're skilled with figures and correspondence. The ranch books need attention, and there's always business letters to be written." "And what of personal matters?" Charlotte asked, her cheeks warming. "I would expect a proper marriage in all respects," Wyatt said quietly. "But I'd not rush you. We would have time to become acquainted, to develop genuine regard for one another." His frankness was both disconcerting and refreshing. There would be no misunderstandings if she accepted his offer. "And if it doesn't work, if we find we don't suit, then I would ensure you have the means to establish yourself elsewhere," Wyatt said simply. "I'm not looking to trap you, Charlotte. I'm offering a partnership different from what you expected with Frederick, but perhaps satisfactory nonetheless." The use of her given name startled her, but she didn't correct him. There was something intimate about this conversation that made formality seem out of place. "I appreciate your honesty," she said. "I'll need time to consider." "Of course," he nodded. "There's no rush. Take whatever time you need," they rejoined Mrs. Holloway, and Wyatt showed them the rest of the property, including the creek that gave the ranch its name. Throughout the tour, Charlotte found herself watching him, the easy way he moved, the respect shown to him by the ranch hands, the gentle handling of a newborn calf they encountered in the barn. By the time they prepared to return to town, Charlotte had a much clearer picture of what life at Twin Creek Ranch might entail. It would be busy, certainly, with hard work and occasional isolation. But there would also be purpose, security, and perhaps, in time, companionship of the deepest kind. "Thank you for the tour," she said as Caleb brought the wagon around. "It's given me much to consider." "The ranch would be fortunate to have you," Wyatt replied, then more softly so only she could hear, "as would I." The words followed Charlotte back to town, echoing in her mind as she prepared for bed that night. "As would I." Not merely practical consideration, but personal interest. The realization was both flattering and terrifying. 3 days later, Charlotte still hadn't reached a decision. She had visited the bank and deposited Frederick's bequest, keeping only a small amount for immediate expenses. She had inquired about eastbound stage schedules and sent letters to several acquaintances in Boston, exploring possibilities there. But something held her back from making definitive plans to leave. Perhaps it was the growing familiarity of Copper Creek, the friendly greetings from shopkeepers, Winnie Davis's cheerful chatter when they met on the street, the comfortable routine of meals at the boarding house. Or perhaps it was Wyatt Morgan, who had called twice more to inquire after her well-being but had not pressed for an answer to his proposal. His restraint impressed her almost as much as his forthright manner had initially disconcerted her. On the fourth day after her visit to the ranch, Charlotte was walking back from the general store when a commotion erupted near the bank. A man staggered out the door, clutching his arm, blood seeping between his fingers. "Stop them," he shouted. "Bank robbers." Two mounted men burst from the bank, saddlebags bulging. Gunshots rang out as the sheriff emerged from his office, firing at the fleeing robbers. One robber returned fire and the sheriff fell. Charlotte pressed herself against the wall of the mercantile as the robbers thundered past. One of them, a rough-looking man with a scraggly beard, spotted her and grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Pretty lady," he called, slowing his horse momentarily. "Maybe I'll come back for you later." Terror froze Charlotte in place as the man laughed and galloped after his companion. Only when they disappeared from view did she find her voice. "Help," she called, rushing toward the fallen sheriff. "Someone help!" Dr. Abernathy arrived moments later, kneeling beside the unconscious lawman. "Bullet grazed his head," he reported. "He'll live, but he's out of commission for now." A crowd gathered, exclamations of shock and anger filling the air. "Those were the Barker brothers," someone said, "been terrorizing towns across the territory." "Someone needs to go after them," another voice insisted. "I'll form a posse," declared the deputy, a young man barely out of his teens. "Need volunteers." To Charlotte's surprise, Wyatt Morgan pushed through the crowd. "I'll ride," he said. "I know the country better than anyone." Other men stepped forward, the blacksmith, two cowboys from neighboring ranches, the livery stable owner. Within minutes, they were mounting up, checking weapons, preparing to pursue the bank robbers. Wyatt spotted Charlotte standing on the boardwalk. He guided his horse over to her. "Are you all right? They didn't harm you?" "I'm fine," she assured him, though she couldn't stop trembling. "One of them, he said something about coming back for me." Wyatt's expression hardened. "That won't happen, we'll catch them." "Be careful," Charlotte said, surprising herself with the depth of concern in her voice. "Please." "I will." He touched the brim of his hat. "Don't worry. Copper Creek takes care of its own." As she watched him ride away with the posse, Charlotte realized with sudden clarity that she had begun to think of herself as part of Copper Creek. When had that happened? When had this dusty frontier town started to feel like somewhere she belonged? The hours dragged by with no news of the posse. Charlotte helped at the doctor's office, assisting Mrs. Abernathy in caring for the wounded bank teller and the sheriff, who had regained consciousness but remained groggy and confused. Darkness fell, and still no word. Charlotte returned to the boarding house for dinner, but she couldn't eat. Mrs. Holloway noticed her pushing food around her plate. "They'll be all right," the older woman assured her. "Wyatt Morgan's too stubborn to get himself killed." "I barely know him," Charlotte protested weakly. "Knowing comes in all sorts of ways," Mrs. Holloway replied cryptically. "Some folks take years to really see each other. Others just days." After dinner, Charlotte sat on the boarding house porch, unable to settle. The night was cool, stars brilliant in the clear sky. Somewhere out there, Wyatt and the others were pursuing dangerous men through unfamiliar terrain. Just after midnight, hoofbeats sounded on the main street. Charlotte rose, straining to see in the darkness. 3 riders approached, then 4, 5, 6. As they drew closer, she could make out Wyatt's tall figure leading the way. She hurried down the steps as the posse reached the sheriff's office. 2 bodies were draped over horses, the bank robbers, either dead or unconscious. The deputy emerged, lantern held high. "Got 'em both," the blacksmith announced proudly. "Caught up to them at Serpent Canyon. Any casualties?" the deputy asked. "Morgan took a bullet in the arm," someone replied. "Nothing serious." Charlotte's heart lurched as Wyatt dismounted, his left sleeve dark with blood. Without thinking, she rushed forward. "You're hurt." He looked surprised to see her. "It's just a scratch." "A scratch that needs tending," she insisted. "Come to the doctor's office." "After we secure the prisoners," Wyatt said, nodding toward one of the draped figures who was stirring and groaning. "I'll handle it," the deputy assured him. "You get that arm looked at." With the immediate crisis resolved, the crowd began to disperse. Charlotte found herself walking beside Wyatt toward the doctor's house, acutely aware of his presence despite the space between them. "You shouldn't have waited up," he said quietly. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. "Not knowing if any of you were safe at the doctor's house, Mrs." Abernathy led them to an examination room. Dr. Abernathy, exhausted from tending the sheriff and bank teller all day, instructed his wife to clean and bandage Wyatt's wound. "I can assist," Charlotte offered. Mrs. Abernathy smiled knowingly. "Of course, dear. Help him remove his shirt while I gather supplies." Left alone with Wyatt, Charlotte felt suddenly shy. "Can you manage, or do you need help?" "Help would be appreciated," he admitted, arms a bit stiff. Charlotte stepped closer, carefully unbuttoning his shirt. The task was intimate in a way she hadn't anticipated. She could feel the warmth of his skin, see the steady rise and fall of his chest, smell the masculine scent of leather and horse and something uniquely him. "Thank you," Wyatt murmured as she eased the shirt from his injured arm. A bullet had grazed his upper arm, leaving a furrow about 3 inches long. It had mostly stopped bleeding but looked painful. Mrs. Abernathy returned with a basin of water, clean cloths, and bandages. "Clean it thoroughly," she instructed Charlotte. "I need to check on the sheriff." Charlotte dampened a cloth and gently cleaned the wound. Wyatt remained still, though she knew it must hurt. "The man who threatened me," she said quietly. "Was he one of the ones you caught?" "Yes." Wyatt's voice was hard. "He won't trouble you or anyone else again. Did you kill him?" "No." "But he'll hang for sure. Bank robbery and shooting the sheriff, that's a hanging offense in any territory." Charlotte nodded, continuing to clean the wound. When she was satisfied it was clean, she applied a salve Mrs. Abernathy had provided, then carefully bandaged his arm. "You have a gentle touch," Wyatt observed. "My father was often ill in his later years," Charlotte explained. "I learned to tend wounds and administer medicines. He's passed 3 years ago. My mother followed 6 months later." Charlotte secured the bandage with a neat knot. "That's why I considered becoming a mail-order bride. There was nothing keeping me in Boston." "And now, is there anything keeping you in Copper Creek?" Wyatt asked, his blue eyes intent on her face. Charlotte met his gaze. "Perhaps there is." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Then Mrs. Abernathy returned, breaking the spell. "A fine job," she approved, inspecting Charlotte's bandaging. "You have a natural talent for nursing." "Thank you," Charlotte said, stepping back from Wyatt, who began carefully pulling his shirt back on. "I'll walk you back to the boarding house," he offered once he was dressed. Outside, the night had grown cooler. Wyatt offered Charlotte his uninjured arm, and she took it, grateful for his steady presence. "I've been thinking about your proposal," she said as they walked, "about what my life might be like at Twin Creek Ranch." And his voice was carefully neutral. "I believe I would like to accept," Charlotte said, the words coming more easily than she had expected. "Not immediately. I'd prefer a proper courtship first, but with the understanding that we are moving toward marriage." Wyatt stopped walking, turning to face her. In the moonlight, his expression was a mixture of surprise and joy. "Are you certain? You barely know me." "I knew even less about Frederick when I agreed to marry him," Charlotte pointed out. "But I've seen enough of you, your kindness, your courage, your integrity to believe we could build a good life together." Wyatt took her hands in his. "I'll do everything in my power to make you happy, Charlotte, to be worthy of the trust you're placing in me." "I know you will," she said simply. He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "May I call on you properly tomorrow evening? Perhaps we could walk to the cafe for supper." "I'd like that very much." The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Charlotte and Wyatt established a courtship that quickly became the talk of Copper Creek. They dined together, attended church together, and spent long hours in conversation, learning about each other's pasts and hopes for the future. Charlotte discovered that Wyatt had grown up on a small farm in Missouri, the youngest of 5 brothers. He had left home at 16, worked his way west as a drover, and eventually settled in Wyoming Territory. His passion for horses and cattle was matched by an unexpected love of literature and music. He played the guitar tolerably well, and could recite long passages of Shakespeare from memory. In turn, she told him about her childhood in Boston, her education at a ladies' seminary, and her brief career as a schoolteacher before her parents' illnesses required her full attention. She spoke of her loneliness after their deaths, the dwindling of family resources, and her decision to seek a new beginning in the West. "I never expected to find happiness here," she confessed one evening as they sat on the boarding house porch. "I thought I was making a practical arrangement with Frederick, not seeking love." "And now," Wyatt asked, his voice gentle. Charlotte met his gaze steadily. "Now I believe I've found both practicality and love." It was the first time either of them had spoken the word aloud, though it had been growing between them with each passing day. Wyatt's expression softened, and he took her hand. "I love you, Charlotte. I think I began to fall in love with you the moment I saw you standing outside the church, so brave and dignified despite the shock you'd received." "And I love you," she replied, the words feeling right and true. "Not because you offered me security when I had none, but because of who you are, the man who rides out to catch bank robbers, who carries lost boys through blizzards, who treats everyone with respect and kindness." Wyatt leaned forward, his hand gently cupping her cheek. "May I kiss you?" In answer, Charlotte closed the distance between them. His lips were warm and gentle against hers, the kiss sweet and full of promise. When they parted, she felt as if something fundamental had shifted in her world, aligning everything perfectly. 2 days later, Wyatt formally proposed, kneeling before her in the boarding house parlor with a ring he had purchased from the jeweler in Cheyenne, a simple gold band with a small but perfect diamond. "I know it's not as fine as Frederick's mother's ring," he said apologetically. "It's perfect," Charlotte assured him, extending her hand so he could slip it onto her finger. "And so fitting that it comes from you, not from Frederick's legacy." They set the wedding date for October 15th. 6 weeks away, time enough for Charlotte to order a proper dress, and for Wyatt to complete the most pressing ranch work before winter set in. Word of their engagement spread quickly. Charlotte was touched by the community's warm response. Gifts appeared at the boarding house. Invitations to tea and dinner multiplied, and women she barely knew offered advice and assistance with wedding preparations. "Told you Copper Creek takes care of its own," Wyatt said with satisfaction after Reverend Peterson's wife presented Charlotte with a beautiful hand-pieced quilt as an early wedding gift. "And I'm one of them now," Charlotte marveled. "How quickly life can change." "For the better, I hope," Wyatt said, squeezing her hand, unquestionably for the better. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of preparations. Charlotte's dress arrived from Denver, a creation of ivory silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Mrs. Holloway helped her alter it for a perfect fit. Winnie Davis insisted on arranging flowers for the church and made Charlotte a wreath of autumn blooms to wear in her hair. At Twin Creek Ranch, Wyatt and the hands were equally busy, completing repairs to the house, building new shelves in the kitchen at Charlotte's request, and ensuring all was in readiness for the mistress's arrival. The night before the wedding, Charlotte sat alone in her boarding house room, reflecting on the extraordinary turn her life had taken. She had come west expecting to marry a stranger named Frederick Thornton. Instead, she would marry Wyatt Morgan, a man who had begun as a stranger, but who now held her heart completely. From her reticule, she removed the velvet box containing Frederick's mother's ring. She had decided not to wear it, preferring Wyatt's simpler diamond as her wedding band. But she would keep it as a reminder of the man whose death had inadvertently led her to true happiness. "Thank you, Frederick," she whispered, closing the box and returning it to her reticule. "I hope you would approve of how things have turned out." The wedding day dawned clear and crisp, the aspens in the hills turning golden with autumn's touch. Charlotte dressed with Mrs. Holloway's help, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened the tiny buttons of her gown. "You look beautiful, Mrs. Holloway declared, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "Wyatt Morgan is a fortunate man." "I'm the fortunate one," Charlotte replied, smoothing the silk of her skirt, "to have found love when I least expected it." The church was filled to capacity when Charlotte arrived on Dr. Abernathy's arm he had offered to give her away in the absence of her father. As the congregation rose, she caught sight of Wyatt standing at the altar, handsome in a new black suit, his face lighting up as he saw her. The walk down the aisle seemed both endless and too brief. Then she was beside him, her hand in his, their voices blending as they spoke their vows. I, Wyatt, take thee, Charlotte, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part, according to God's holy ordinance. And thereto I plight thee my troth. I, Charlotte, take thee, Wyatt, to be my wedded husband. The words came easily, her heart full to overflowing, the exchange of rings, the pronouncement, the kiss, all passed in a blur of joy. Then they were walking back down the aisle as husband and wife, the congregation's applause and good wishes surrounding them like a blessing. The celebration continued at the town hall, decorated for the occasion with autumn leaves and flowers. There was dancing, feasting, and many toasts to the bride and groom. As twilight fell, Wyatt led Charlotte to the waiting buggy that would take them to their home, now truly hers as well as his. Happy Mrs. Morgan. He asked as they drove away from town, the sounds of celebration fading behind them. Completely, she replied, leaning against his shoulder. Though I still can't quite believe how it all happened, that I came to attend a funeral and found my future instead. Perhaps Frederick had a hand in it, Wyatt suggested. He always did have a knack for bringing the right people together. Charlotte smiled at the thought. Then I'm grateful to him for bringing us together in the most unexpected way. As they approached Twin Creek Ranch, Charlotte saw lanterns glowing in the windows of the house Mrs. Fletcher's work, preparing the home for their arrival. The sight filled her with a sense of rightness, of belonging. Wyatt drew the buggy to a halt before the house and turned to his bride. "Welcome home, Charlotte." "Home," she repeated, the word rich with meaning. "I like the sound of that." He helped her down from the buggy, then surprised her by sweeping her into his arms. "I believe it's traditional to carry the bride across the threshold," he explained with a grin. Charlotte laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck as he carried her up the steps and through the door into their future together, a future neither of them had planned, but both now embraced with full hearts. 5 years later, Charlotte stood on the porch of Twin Creek Ranch, watching as Wyatt lifted their 3-year-old daughter, Willow, onto a gentle pony. Their 1-year-old son, Frederick, named for the man who had inadvertently brought them together, slept peacefully in her arms. "Not too fast," she called as Wyatt led the pony around the corral. "She's a natural, just like her mother," Wyatt called back, pride evident in his voice. Charlotte smiled, remembering her own first tentative horseback rides shortly after their marriage. She had progressed from nervous novice to confident rider under Wyatt's patient instruction, just as she had grown from uncertain bride to assured ranch wife and mother. The ranch had prospered under their joint stewardship. Charlotte's head for business complemented Wyatt's knowledge of ranching, and together they had expanded operations, added a small orchard, and even opened a horse breeding program specializing in the sturdy, intelligent mounts Wyatt had always admired. Life wasn't always easy. Droughts, harsh winters, and occasional illness tested them. But they faced each challenge together, their love deepening with each passing season. As Charlotte watched her husband and daughter laughing together in the afternoon sunlight, she reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought her to this moment. She had traveled west to marry a man she had never met, only to find him dead upon her arrival. Yet from that tragic beginning had come the greatest joy of her life, a love she had never expected, but now couldn't imagine living without. Wyatt glanced up, catching her eye across the yard. His smile, still capable of quickening her pulse after 5 years of marriage, warmed her through and through. He lifted Willow from the pony and set her on her feet. "Go show Mama what a good rider you are," he instructed, and the little girl ran toward Charlotte, dark curls bouncing, her father's blue eyes shining with excitement. As Charlotte knelt to embrace her daughter, baby Frederick still cradled in one arm, she felt Wyatt's hand come to rest on her shoulder. They were bound together not merely by vows spoken in a church, but by thousands of moments shared, hardships weathered, and joys celebrated. A love born in the most unlikely circumstances, yet as enduring as the mountains that cradled their valley home. "Happy?" Wyatt asked, Echoing the question he had asked on their wedding day, Charlotte looked up at him, her heart full. More than I ever dreamed possible. And in that moment, surrounded by the family they had created together, Charlotte knew that her journey west had led her exactly where she was meant to be all along, not to Frederick Thornton, but to Wyatt Morgan, to Twin Creek Ranch, to a love that had transformed a mail-order bride's practical arrangement into a life of genuine joy and fulfillment on the wild Wyoming frontier.